Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special episode with Elder Randy Fred. Elder Randy Fred, or Uncle Randy, hails from the Tseshaht First Nation in Port Alberni, British Columbia. After living in paradise in Barclay Sound, he attended the Alberni Indian Residential School for 9 years. He was a plaintiff in the precedent-setting case Blackwater, where the United Church of Canada and the Government of Canada were sued for sexual abuse. This case led to the Alternative Dispute Resolution and the formation of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. After a lifetime of working in multimedia, he is now an elder in residence at Vancouver Island University. In this special episode, we are given an amazing opportunity to speak with a changemaker.
Uklamash Wiki Kasi, Tseshaht. My name is Randy Fred. I'm Tseshaht from Port Alberni, British Columbia. And my name, Wiki Kasi, is by no means a traditional name. It was a name given to me by one of my granddaughters. And it simply means no eyes because I'm totally blind. And I want to just start with a little song. Hua hey ya ahai. Sinai ya 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 hua ya 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 etu sha ya ya hey Sinai ya 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 hua ya 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 etu sa ya hey Sinai ya 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 hua ya ya. Woo. That was one of my father's favorite songs, and he never sang it the same way twice. It's a fun song. It's called Quiquacha.
Thank you for sharing that. All right. Just in listening to it, I always like to hear the different drum beats for many nations across Turtle Island and beyond. Even for my own community where I am, we have this little water drum that's not exactly large. There's many teachings around the water drum, its symbolism in our community, and how it's used both in ceremony and also for everyday singing. For me, it's a very important tool because how it was explained to me is, and this might be a universal understanding that you might think about as well and respond to, is to us, it symbolizes like the beat of the earth, right? And that's a message that a lot of people and singing groups speak to. And there's one particular group I know of that's from the Akwesasne community they call themselves Gondiwana Hawi. They're a Mohawk women singing group, and they do a lot of our songs and using a women's new shuffle dance. I remember the one song that's about the water. There's a phrasing in the song that talks about, can you all hear the earth beat? The sound of the heart that's beating. And I always get struck by that question that they pose in the song. Or yeah, I think it's more to do with a question because it's really asking the people who's listening to hear if they can hear the beat. And that just reminds me of that when I always hear the drums. And so I was wondering, just out of curiosity, in your own learning about drums from your community, your perspective, is there teachings you've heard or what teachings you know and would be comfortable sharing in this discussion for our listeners?
Well, the description in Nuchana's territory is the beat of the heart. And my father was a well-known lullaby singer, and he could make any baby fall asleep. He was a really big man. He was really muscular. He was a commercial fisherman and a real hard worker. Big, strong guy, and he could really sing these lullabies. It was really cool. And he had a little white dog, and as soon as he pulled out his drum and started beating on the drum, the little dog would get on his hind legs and be bouncing around, a little tongue hanging out of its mouth. It was really cute. But definitely, it's just the drum is such a universal instrument that just it represents different things to different people, and it you know, can emote all kinds of emotions, you know, and feelings, and it's really good to see a real strong revival on the West Coast with young people learning to drum and sing and dance. It was almost extinct. You know, my late uncle George Clutesy, he had some fame as a writer, actor, and artist, and he had a job in the Alberni Indian Residential School as a maintenance man in the 1960s. And when I was in court in the Blackwater case, we were suing the United Church of Canada and the government of Canada for abuses imposed on us when we were under their care. Some of the plaintiffs from up around Prince Rupert area were laughing and saying, "Yeah, we still remember some of your songs and dances because your uncle taught us how to sing and dance in the school." And he had approached me and he asked me, he told me, he said, "You know, you're Tseshaht. You should be, you know, I'm teaching these kids Tseshaht songs and dances, your songs and dances. You should be part of the group." And so, you know, at the age of 10 or 11, I was so ashamed of being First Nations, I didn't join the group, you know, and we were always doing things in the school in resistance, right? And so that was part of my resistance too, you know, to conform to, you know, those horrible people who were looking after us.
I always like having opportunities to speak with people from all over Canada. And like a lot of what I know and a lot of the stories I've heard in my community and the context how I look at residential schools is from the perspective of Ontario and Indigenous communities, First Nations communities here in Ontario. And for those listening who might not be familiar with the history of your community and your people on the West Coast, what would you, is there like a specific timeline story you tell about that story of your people in the context of colonialism and contact with settlers who arrived in the West Coast, British Columbia area? Because again, the history and how things happened on the East Coast compared to the West Coast is drastically different.
Yeah, you know, something I find really interesting is there were laws that were actually unwritten. You know, like I haven't heard of any law stating that. Well, I guess in the Indian Act it might have. When I was 5, we were living in a very isolated community way out on the West Coast, 3 miles outside of Bamfield, and in the Broken Group Islands. It's now part of Pacific Rim Park. And in fact, if you look at that map, you'll see an island called Keith Island. And we knew that place as Kakmakam. And my grandfather's name was Kicha. So, you know, we can safely assume that Keith came from Kicha. And we were living closer there, a place called Dodgers Cove, and it was paradise. There was just an abundance of sea life and all kinds of food. Like we could live quite well on our own there. And one day, this in the spring, this beautiful boat came into the harbor, and these two guys come ashore in a skiff. And my mom goes down to the beach. My dad was out fishing. My mom went down to the beach to meet them, and I was hiding behind her. And one of them asked her, "How old's that boy there?" And she said, "5." "Well, I'm sorry to tell you, but we're coming back here in the fall, and if that boy is here, we'll have to haul you off to jail." And so I never thought of it again, but my older siblings came home for the summer, Labor Day weekend. I just assumed we were bringing them back to the school, and I didn't know that I was going to be left there. And you know, the interesting thing, when we were in court, every one of the plaintiffs could remember their first day at the school. And mine was my father bringing me up those front stairs, handing me off to this man. I started screaming. He brought me to the principal's office. And then after that, this man led me up to the top floor, 3-story building. And dorm 5 is where the young boys slept. And he brought me in there, put me in the shower, and then he had a fire extinguisher full of bug killer. And while I was in the shower, he sprayed me head to toe with this bug killer. And that was my welcome to the school. So both my parents went to the residential school. a couple of my younger siblings didn't go because by then they're moving towards shutting down the schools. I think eventually they would have shut down anyway, but I was working for the tribal council in Port Alberni as their accountant when we shut down the Alberni school. And we moved in and used it as our office, tribal council office. And then that was really, really weird for me to be working there. A lot of bad memories in that place. So they, many of us know the history now, how it originated the United States. And then there's that Canadian politician who went down there, checked it out, and then really pushed to have them set up across the country. The contracts with the churches, between the churches and the government of Canada, they were so ridiculous, like they didn't give them enough for, all the necessities, and they didn't give them much for wages. It was what I term the bottom of the workforce barrel. They ended up with people who couldn't get work anywhere else, like people discharged from the armed forces and back in the 50s, back 40, 30s, 40, 50s. If you got an dishonorable discharge, forget about trying to get work anywhere. Like, nobody would give you a job. And the same if you were kicked out of the RCMP. So those were the kinds of people that were being hired because they couldn't get work anywhere else. The wages were so poor. And some of them did get a place to stay. They actually slept at the school. But real sadists, pedophiles, just brutal people, like very demented people. There was one young guy, I'm pretty sure he had shell shock from Korea, and he would just go berserk, like just absolutely berserk on one of us, and the older boys would have to pull him off. Otherwise, he'd kill the kid. Like, he was crazy. And then, of course, there was Plint, who got 11 years in jail for sexual abuse. I don't know if that guy ever slept. Man, there was 18 guys in Port Alberni who laid criminal charges against him. There's an additional 18 in Chilliwack, and I was in on that second one. And he got 11 years in Port Alberni, and then 11 years concurrent when he was in Chilliwack. And then there was 30 plaintiffs in the Blackwater case. And there's 16 of us still alive today. And so it's a document that hasn't been videotaped, been video recorded. So I really want to do this show about the court cases. And I'm just frantically seeking an Indigenous producer right now to take it on, because I don't have the experience with distribution and with broadcast. And so we need somebody with those credentials, and we're pretty well ready to roll with it all. We'll work with the plaintiffs and their family members and supporters in developing the story, like how are we going to carry the story? How are we going to tell a story? But we'll have a lot of involvement in it. And then we're going to have a gathering in Nanaimo and a gathering in Prince Rupert. And these will be to honor the first 5 former students who laid criminal charges. Melvin Gooden, Stanley Gooden, Nanaimo, and then Willie Blackwater, Gilbert Johnson, Gilbert's brother, I can't think of his name, Rudy Johnson. And then we want to take that opportunity to thank all the people who helped us when we were in court, because our court was a precedent case. It started in Vancouver, came over to Nanaimo, and there was so much testimony. There were so many horrible stories shared on the witness stand, and so people actually got to hear these stories, and it was very traumatic, because the role of the United Church lawyer and the Government of Canada lawyer was to prove that we were liars. So they asked the same questions over and over and over, and it was very moving when we got to Prince Rupert. Like the first part of the case, civil action, was called vicarious liability, and that was determined who was responsible. Was it the church, the government, Plint? Like, they were named, but the judge dropped Plint because he was old and he had no assets. And so then how much responsibility were each of them going to take? And so then the lawyers' final arguments, they agreed to move it to Prince Rupert because so many of the plaintiffs were from up there. Former students were from around that area. And the mayor of Prince Rupert let us use the community center for 3 nights in a row. And it was just amazing. Like, the first night, the feast was hosted by the Tsimshian and Gitsan, the second night by the Nishka, and the third night by the Haida. Like there was many students from each of those nations that went to the Alberni school. And so there was food like you couldn't imagine, just this whole row of tables of all kinds of seafood and game, and it was an amazing feast. And the songs and dances were incredible. And then many people for the first time in their lives stood up and disclosed their residential school stories. So it was very emotional. So from there, the cases moved back to the Lower Mainland and went on for several more years. But the real rip-off of it all was that it was as though the plaintiffs in the precedent-setting case were being penalized because we had to pay lawyers legal fees, and the thousands of people who came behind us with, basically out of court settlements. Some of them may have had to pay a small legal fee, but the majority didn't have to pay a legal fee. But after being in court for several years, the question that keeps coming up in my mind is, was justice served? So that's a tough one. In one way, for me, it was, because after hearing myself talk about myself for days on the witness stand, I made a decision that I didn't want to be that guy that I was talking about. I wanted to be somebody else. I wanted to be a good father. I wanted to be a good husband. And so it had that positive impact on me. But the value of our lives was so diminished. I had to go to continue in court because I couldn't accept I think it was $17,000 or something. They offered me an out of court settlement for 9 years of abuse. And so in the end, I was awarded $97,000 in court. But the lawyer took half. Like when you look at the United States, it starts from Oregon, $3 million for sexual abuse, similar to ours. And then when you get to Texas, it's 8 million. Then when you get to New York, it's 11 million. So for us to be under 100,000 was a real slap in the face. Of course, some of the people who settled out of court got fairly reasonable settlements, but we're not supposed to know or disclose the amount. So now, one thing that I've realized is that how as a visually impaired Indigenous person, like how am I able to do stuff? The stuff that I do. And I was thinking, like when the Okanagan people bought Thetis Books Limited, the book publishing company I founded, one of my friends up there, August, he was a genius. And his sister told me that when they decided from the day he was born that the family was going to let him roam free. He could explore whatever he wanted, do whatever he wanted, and they would just look after his safety. And it turned out in grade 8, he quit school because they weren't teaching him math and science fast enough. And so he homeschooled. By the time the Commodore 64s came out, he bought one and learned to program it. And he had it speaking an Okanagan language. He had his bedroom rigged up with a motion detector. And so when somebody opened the door, it would say, Augie, somebody's coming. and then we would tease him and say, yeah, Augie, you're going to have all these young Okanagan people walking around talking like robots, because the Commodore 64 didn't have a very good sound system. It sounded very robotic. But, as a child, before I started school, I was in a similar situation, where I didn't have anybody to play with. So, I was always outside, and we had a little dog. And so I got to do whatever I wanted. If I wanted to go somewhere in a canoe, at the age of 5, I was fine going in a canoe by myself and going to an island nearby. There was one friend there that was there once in a while, and I could go play with him when he was there. And I could roam around that island, and it was the same when we lived in other places. I could just roam around, and I remember in Ucluelet there was a boardwalk. It went right through the middle of the reserve, and when I walked on there was always somebody whose door was open, and they would call me, and I would go there, and they'd ask me who I was, and I would tell them, and then they'd sit me down, give me a little treat. Milk or tea or something, cookie. It was such an amazing place, it was a real community. And now when I go there's no boardwalk, it's roads, cars everywhere. And I went to one of my first cousin's houses. This was just before the holidays. And she said there's even neighbors that she doesn't even know. They don't talk to each other. And it's so sad, I know it's a universal kind of a thing, people are really losing touch with each other. So one thing I'm doing is I organize one in spirit walks, I call them. And very basic. I start with a song, a prayer, land acknowledgement. Oh, by the way, I must acknowledge I'm in the land of Listenanemo, and I thank them for that. Thank them for sharing their history, knowledge, language, and I forgot what I started talking about.
These things happen, when we get talking and there's our minds are we have many thoughts happening all the time. And for me, that's a similar experience
Yeah.
that I always find myself living through. And I just kind of want to go back to
Mm-hmm.
story, and there's just so much there. And I think that's a very, there's a lot to unpack and everything. And in your particular thing, when the school was given back to, I think, your community, or the organization was working at the former residential school in your community. It reminds me of my community with the Mohawk Institute. And it's ironic today, and where I happen to put my shirt on today. And this, I'm wearing an orange shirt, by the way. And it's the shirts that the Woodland Cultural Center sells. And a person who takes out just the top shirt on the top. I take out the top shirt in my dresser, and today happened to come to that orange shirt, and it's for the Woodland Cultural Center to help save the evidence. And the Save the Evidence campaign is primarily about not dismantling and destroying the former Mohawk Institute, but holding on to it because it's now a teaching tool that the community uses to teach about residential schools. And so that reminded me of that and what that means to have that building present. There's a language department there in the former building. They're restoring it and renovating it to reflect what the school would have looked like through time. There are different periods that the school operated, but they're trying to focus particular on different moments. And so I wanted to share that and just draw attention to the wider audience listening to that the Mohawk Institute and Save the Evidence campaign is something all of us should be aware of, just because there are different actions and different approaches people take to address the history of colonialism. And as I was listening to your story, Randy, something that I'm always fascinated with learning more about, in fact, is how this work we do can be something utilized by teachers. So Defining Moments has created many teaching resources, and this whole project is a teaching resource, in fact. And I work with teacher candidates at my institution in the Faculty of Education. And so I guess if you had the opportunity yourself to speak to, say, a teacher candidate or people training to become teachers, what message would you want them to think about or to reflect on as they move forward into their career in teaching? And teacher candidates are in their professional years of the program. So in my province, there's a 2-year program after undergraduate degree. So there's a total of 6 years of education. And their professional years constitutes their fine-tuning or gaining of teaching and learning theories, with combined with practical aspects of it. So if you had a message to those students who will become teachers eventually through your completion of degree, what would you want them to hear and think about?
Well, I think it's a topic of reconciliation. I think we all need to revisit, the calls to action. Refresh our memories. What are those calls to action all about? And reconciliation is not a one-way street. It takes into account Indigenous values, virtues, and that's the most critical part of reconciliation. Is taking those to hearts and taking those to our hearts and putting them into practice. The most important value of all is love. For a time, that word was removed from our education system. I never heard the word love in a classroom. Never. Even my parents, like they never told their children that they loved them. And that was because of the residential school. They never hugged us. But fortunately, before they passed away, I'm pretty sure that they were able to give us all a hug and tell us all that they loved us. And those values that we have to put into practice to be able to communicate effectively with each other. And reconciliation is a process of getting to know each other. I have no fear sharing my story, because I know that stories are healing. And that's the reason I formed One in Spirit Healing Art Society, And what I started talking about was one in spirit walks, and very basic, where I take a dozen participants and start with a song and a prayer and a little bit about the history of the place, and then share my story, and then we walk, and I give them an opportunity to get to meet each other while we're walking. And then when we come to a spot where we can stand in a circle, I get each of them to introduce themselves and share their story. Now that is reconciliation. I started these with the Multicultural Society in Nanaimo, and there was always lots of tears because there was always somebody from a war-torn country. And when I led walks for the university, there was always tears. And that was mainly because so many of the professors had never, ever shared their own story before. I know it was really beneficial to them because some of them emailed me afterwards, and very, very, very touching stories. The importance of story must be incorporated into our education. Because on these walks, how I end it when everybody's shared their story is I get everybody to hug each other and to hug me. And the atmosphere changes. Like it really does. And so if we can, we go and share a lunch afterwards. And by then everybody's so relaxed and happy and lots of laughter. They're really lots of fun. So I think that's the other part of education, I think, is we must combat nature deprivation, because nature deprivation is a huge problem. Our young people are really losing touch with nature. And nature has so much to teach us, and that's something that I like to teach on the walks, is different things about, what they used to call traditional ecological knowledge, which they're finding through research, is all true, like First Nations people have always known that trees communicate with each other, but science has finally proven it. Just last year, I think it was UBC came out with this big research paper about trees how they communicate with each other. It's so cool. And even inanimate, like the Nuchana phrase is Hishukish Zawak. Everything is one. We are all one. All the people, we are one. But we're one with the animals, we're one with the birds, we're one with the sea creatures, the plants, and everything. And even the inanimate, the rocks, even the rocks, like science is discovering that, well, they've known for a long time that crystals give off different energies, and they can be beneficial to us in different ways. There's still much that science can learn from nature, and it's really gratifying to see governments giving credence to traditional ecological knowledge and allowing First Nations people to share their knowledge and history and culture by taking part in management of, out here in BC, it's the forests, because of the forest fires. First Nations people used to control the fires and prevent fires, and the governments are utilizing their knowledge now, and that only makes sense.
Mm-hmm. And just thank you for sharing that. Like, it's revolutionary, I guess, for some, but like the traditional ecological knowledge piece you shared is another way of saying we confirming what's already known. And I always am fascinated when that happens, because we already knew this, or we talk about the idea of scientific knowledge, or that whole conceptualization of something, a phenomenon in nature, through a story or through a different way of looking at things. And that's a lot of what I do with my students. I tell them, I said, this here, a word, for example, in my language would have, like, this is a loose translation of the word. That's not, and to me, it sounds like this. And I use their own knowledge about subject matters as such to think about it and to see the similarities. And going back to reconciliation and your work you do with it, and this idea of bringing back those, like the empathy. What I teach and tell my students in the Kigo language class is Gindaumshrat, or compassion, right? Teach with compassion, because a lot of that wasn't in residential schools, and you can even argue some of that's still lacking in our schools today. And I just say that's how I teach, it's how I communicate, it's how I convey knowledge with you, is through compassion, because this is comes from my a place that's very personal and close to me. And I use myself as a way to understand things, to see things from my own perspectives, and to feel that compassion, because that's what fuels my learning. And I kind of want to focus a little bit more. I think we have time for one more question, so to speak. And I'm curious to see, to have our listeners to hear more about your work, because from what I know about your work already, you've published a lot of books on different subject matter. You do various types of works through your career. Is there any other projects that you're working on today? And you talked a lot about this film you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
So you can speak to elaborating would why film, and what does film mean to you? That's one question. Or two, you can share with us other projects you're doing in your work, because you talk a lot about healing. So even other stuff like such.
Yeah, both. I'll answer both. Okay, um, this video documentary that I want to see produced about the Alberni Indian Residential School court cases is critical for our history. It's critical for our documentation because it was a milestone on the road leading to truth and reconciliation in Canada. Like, we were a precedent-setting case. So the cases started in 1995. In 1988, I published Resistance and Renewal: Surviving the Indian Residential School by Celia Hay Brown. And nobody then wanted to talk about sexual abuse. Nobody wanted to talk about Indian residential schools. And then when we heard about the 215 unmarked graves in Kamloops, I got a hold of Celia and said, you really should think about putting this book out again. And she was a bit reluctant at first, but she came through with a really nice rewrite, got permission from all the subjects, because she had done it for her master's thesis in education. And so it was anonymous, but she got permission from everybody. So the rewrite it reads much nicer with people's names in it. The introduction, we got Gary Godfredson, a very good writer, very excellent poet from Kamloops, to write the introduction. And so I got to meet him, and we promoted the book on September 30th. We had a book launch in Kamloops at the residential school there, the former residential school building. And there's a few hundred people there, and it was really, really an amazing event. One other project that I'm working on is Blacklight Puppet Theater project. And one of our board members, Louis Beck, he went to Toronto and met Diane Dupuis, who founded and owns Famous Players Theater in Toronto. They're disabled people who are puppeteers, and it's black light. So the puppeteers aren't black, so you can't see them. And they do, like an Elvis, life-size puppets. So Elvis, Liberace helped them get launched, brought them to Vegas. And so Diane gave Louis permission to copy whatever we want from her project. So we're working with an organization here in Nanaimo called Clay Tree Society, and they have over 100 clients who are very disadvantaged with learning, different disabilities. I just wrote a script about Hishikish Tsawak, everything is one. So we'll use animals, birds, and fish puppets and just teach that concept, for our initial project. But a long-term goal is we're going to actually set up a dinner theater like Diane Dupuis in Toronto. And then we'll, 3 nights a week would give the disabled puppeteers enough for, full-time wage, enough to survive on. And then the other 4 nights a week, we can, make it available to other groups, because it'd be a dinner theater setup, and, they could use it for fundraisers or whatever. But it'd be a perfect place to have some First Nations content too. So I'm looking forward to that.
Those are projects sound so fascinating. I never heard of the puppeteer theaters and doing puppet theater like that. It's so moving. I'm not familiar too much in the arts, but I'm not surprised by when I hear things happening as such. And I think that's great for our listeners to just draw attention to ways in which story is being told. And I think that always resonates with me when anyone talks about that concept of story, because any type of art you can think of is telling a particular story. And for me, that always strikes close to home for me. And yeah, I wanted to say thank you for sharing that and to drawing our attention and to what's available for us to learn more about what's happening on the grassroots. And it sounds like you have this is not your first go around when it comes to theater and doing such work. So it's always great to meet someone in your at your capacity as well. And so I guess before we close, I do want to have one last question, I guess. If there's a message you have for anyone if you have a message for people listening in this episode, what message would you want people to think about as they move forward on their own journey?
Do not be afraid to share your personal story. In fact, share your personal story every chance you get because it's healing. And even science knows that because, there's 3 hospitals in the Toronto region that prescribe books to their patients. And they discovered that it enhanced their healing, reading books. And there's so many stories about different art forms, being healing, and I know that stories are healing. So I really encourage people to share stories.
All right. Now, thank you, Randy, for sharing that with us. What you shared today is so much, there's so much there. And I'm fumbling for words, and it's not to do with I'm nervous or anything, but what you shared and walked us through today is that there is that much to think about. And I excel at writing conclusions of my own writing, and I excel at wrapping things up neatly to go to the next topic or to conclude a particular discussion. But what you shared, my mind's like not distorted, but there's so many things in my head that's trying to piece itself together. And I think even after today, I will continue to think about this, especially the word with language. And I'll have to get the spelling from you, and we can put it in the show notes just for people listening, because I think it's always pertinent for people to know more about Indigenous languages and the depth that language carries. And it's not really so much a means of communication. Like my own research is in Indigenous language. For me, the language contains our ontology and how we see things. It's not to say you're greeting someone with hello. That's not what's happening, right? In my own language, we say scan out again. It's are you well? Do you have good well-being? Are you well? Is what it's asking. Different than saying, are you okay? It's more to do with that, right? It's not, and this is my own interpretation of the word too, because I'm still learning language and still studying it. But there's so much more than just saying hello. It's saying you're at peace with one another. Is your peace well? Like that's many different iterations I've heard through people talking about it.
Yeah.
I think our listeners should consider what languages in our community, in our area, because that opens up a whole worldview. And so I want to say thank you, Yao, for talking with me today and sharing your thoughts on everything.
My pleasure.
I would like to take a moment to express my dearest gratitude to Uncle Randy for joining us in this special episode of We Need to Talk About Bryce. In listening to Uncle Randy, I am reminded of the wisdom survivors hold, carry, and retell through their creative works. It is moving to hear how a changemaker persists to not let the narratives of Indian residential schools fall silent. As we have heard today, memories of our youth are ingrained in our very thinking, for Uncle Randy reminds us everyone can remember their first day. As we continue our learning in this podcast, sit and reflect with the critical questions survivors are asking of us. Was justice served sticks with me and inspires me to pursue justice for those that came forward and for those survivors who chose not to. I wanted to say thank you all for listening, and I hope you find resonance with Uncle Randy's words as I have.